Hola, buenos días. Por favor, vamos tomando asiento, que vamos a dar comienzo a esta conferencia plenaria. Bueno, conferencia plenaria que bajo el título de Cronobiología, su papel en la terapia médica nutricional, va a ser impartida por el profesor Hassan Dashti, que voy a hacer una pequeña presentación de él, una breve introducción. Su currículum es muy extenso, pero voy a dar algunos datos sobre su actividad. Él es profesor adjunto en el Departamento de Anestesia, Cuidados Intensivos y Medicina del Dolor del Hospital General de Massachusetts y de la Facultad de Medicina de Harvard. Es dietista colegiado, investigador científico, con interés en nutrición clínica, cronobiología, sueño y genética. Y su investigación se centra, sobre todo lo que busca, es comprender la relación bidireccional entre la nutrición y el sueño, así como también el papel del horario de las comidas como factor de riesgo en enfermedades cardiometabólicas, tanto en poblaciones sanas como en colectivos de pacientes. Él es miembro de la Sociedad Americana de Nutrición Parenteral y Enteral, la ASPEN, y su trabajo pues, ha sido financiado por instituciones del Instituto Nacional de Salud Americano, el NIH, y también de la Fundación de Investigación Aspen Rhodes y de la Academia Americana de Medicina del Sueño. Y actualmente es editor asociado de la revista Advancing Nutrition de la Sociedad Americana de Nutrición. Es miembro de la Junta Directiva de la Fundación de Investigación Aspen Rhodes y también miembro del Consejo Editorial de la revista Nutrition in Clinical Practice de la Aspen. En cuanto a su formación, él hizo su formación postdoctoral en el Centro de Medicina Genómica del Hospital General de Massachusetts, colaborando con la doctora Saxena para desentrañar la base genética del sueño y los ritmos y rasgos circadianos, y se doctoró en la Escuela de Nutrición Friedman de la Universidad de Tufts, tras realizar sus prácticas de internado en dietética en el Hospital Brigham and Women's de Boston, Massachusetts. No cabe duda de que el doctor Dashti es una autoridad en esta materia. Para nosotros es un honor y un placer recibirle. Thank you for accept to come to our Congress, and please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's truly an honor for me to be presenting to you all today, and I'm really excited to share with you some of my own research, as well as research from other audience members and others' research as well on the topic of chrononutrition, and really thinking of the role of chronobiology in the way that we administer medical nutrition therapy. So most of the research that I'll be presenting today has already been published, so feel free to take pictures and videos as well of this talk. Okay. So in the field of nutrition, traditionally the two aspects of nutrition that we predominantly talk about are quantity and quality. We talk about calories, we talk about sources of nutrition, animal sources, plant sources, and those really form the foundation of most dietary guidelines, most of the recommendations that we give with regards to nutrition. However, an emerging player in the field is timing, and this is what this talk is going to be focused on. What is the role of timing on cardiometabolic health, and how can we think of timing of nutrition support to better support our patients? And the talk today will be divided into three sections. First, I'm going to start very broadly. I'll provide you with an introduction on chrononutrition to give you an understanding of the foundations of chrononutrition and why it matters. Next, I'll talk about the role of chronobiology in a hospital setting, particularly how can we align nutrition support with the circadian rhythms of our patients to better support them. And then I'll end with a discussion of home nutrition support, so home enteral and home parenteral nutrition, and talk about the sleep patterns of patients who consume enteral and parenteral nutrition in a home setting. Okay, so let's get started. So what do we mean by chrononutrition? And in a recent expert workshop, we put together this definition. Chrononutrition is an emerging dimension of nutrition. It's an active area of research that examines timing-related aspects of nutrition and its impact on circadian rhythms, its impact on various biological processes, including metabolism and sleep, and also its impact on disease pathogenesis. We also think of chrononutrition as a potential form of chronotherapy. So you might know light therapy as a form of chronotherapy, especially in the context of psychiatric disorders like PTSD or depression. And similarly, we're thinking of how could we time our nutrition as a way to decrease disease risk as well. Okay. I'm going to start very broadly to give you understanding of what are circadian rhythms, what is the circadian clock, in case this is potentially new to you. So the circadian clock is also called the biological clock. It's our internal clock. And this clock is endogenous, it's within us, and it produces 24-hour rhythms. The clock was first identified in the brain, in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and then scientists started identifying that these clocks actually permeate an entire organism. So there are clocks in various organ types and various tissues, as well as cell types. Not only do these clocks exist, they talk to each other so that the entire organism is functioning under one time zone. And at the molecular level, the clock is maintained by a group of genes called clock genes. These genes form a 24-hour transcriptional translational feedback loop, and it's this loop that maintains this clock within us. These genes also influence thousands of downstream genes, and that's why this clock is so important. It affects so many other genes and processes as well. Of course, sleep is one of them, but also metabolism and immunity are other processes that is under circadian control. So, although the system is within us, it's internal and endogenous, it does respond to the environment. So things like light exposure, eating, and exercise are all things that could influence the clock. And that's a great thing. That means that if we travel across time zones, like myself, I could acclimate to the new time zone by exposing myself to early light, eating early in the morning, and exercising in the morning. That helps reset smart clock or adjust the clock so that I could now adjust to the new time zone that I'm in. Anything that is under circadian control shows a rhythm, and those rhythms are called circadian rhythms. And an easy example of a circadian rhythm is just your body temperature. If you measure your body temperature across 24 hours, you'll notice that it increases during the day, and then it decreases at night. So if you keep measuring it, you'll notice that it shows this kind of rhythm. Another example that we all are very familiar with is melatonin. We all know melatonin as the sleep hormone. Melatonin rhythmicity is so strong that we can use it to indicate whether a body is in morning mode or is working under night mode. Melatonin was initially thought to only influence sleep, but we now know that melatonin is also involved in various other biological pathways as well. Okay. There's a lot of research that tells us that disrupting the circadian clock and disrupting circadian rhythms could lead to adverse health outcomes. So we can disrupt our system by doing things at the wrong time. For example, exercising at night or eating at night could disrupt our clock. And also, if our clocks in our different tissues are not aligned or not in sync, that could also lead to circadian disruption. And research has shown that circadian disruption not only leads to disruptions in sleep, but also leads to many other diseases, including neurologic, psychiatric, cardiovascular, and metabolic. And disrupting our circadian rhythm is actually very common, especially in this modern society that we're in. Eating at night, for example, could lead to some circadian disruption. Also, doing any night shifts for doctors and nurses could lead to circadian disruption. And also, any light exposure at night, even using your phone at night in bed, that could lead to a degree of circadian disruption. Of course, to a lesser extent. Okay, so what about nutrition? And we talk about chrononutrition because there's a biological basis why nutrition is important for chronobiology. And there are two main reasons why that is. Light could affect the clocks in our periphery, but it does not affect the clock in our brain, which is the master clock. So eating at night leads to these clocks to be desynchronized, no longer ticking at the same time zone. And that is what we call internal desynchrony. So having internal desynchrony is one of the pathways where eating could lead to these adverse health outcomes that are associated with circadian disruption. The other mechanism is circadian misalignment. So our bodies are designed so that they do things very well at very particular times of the day. We can sleep very well at night, and we can digest food very well during the daytime. If we eat at night, we're in a case of circadian misalignment because now our behaviors are not matching with our circadian rhythms. Our body is able to digest the food at night, but to a lesser extent. There's an impairment to that process, which I'll provide you more evidence of. Okay, so while it might seem that chrononutrition is a new science that is in fashion now, there has been actually decades of research on the field of chrononutrition, and I'll describe those to you. Some of these studies, of course, not all of them. The very first study to talk about timing of nutrition was actually related to human breast milk. What these investigators were interested in is how does breast milk differs in the morning and in the evening. So what they did in this study, which was published in The Lancet in 1949, was take samples of breast milk that was produced at different times of the day and look at the composition and compare the composition across 24 hours. And what they found was that morning human milk was enriched for cortisol, and nighttime human milk was enriched for melatonin. And that gave us an idea that time of day results in different feeding patterns, and that perhaps we as humans need to eat differently at different times of the day because of what we could be getting from the foods. Several decades later, we start seeing new sets of studies on chrononutrition done by the Army labs. So you might wonder, why is the Army interested in chrononutrition? And that's because when soldiers typically go to battle, food is very scarce. So they want to know, should the soldiers eat in the morning or should they eat in the evening? And what effect does that have on the performance of these soldiers? This was a very nice, simple study where they had soldiers eat only in the morning, so have only breakfast, or have only dinner. And they did 24-hour physiological parameters. And what they found that compared to the morning, eating at night led to changes in 24-hour blood pressure, changes in temperature, and changes in immunity. Not only that, it also shifted rhythmicity of various other hormones, including growth hormone and insulin. And that gives us an indication that shifting our eating leads to changes in physiological processes. Okay, fast forward many years, 2009. This was a study that gained a lot of publicity. It was a very simple mouse study, and what they did was they fed mice a high-fat diet. One group was fed only during the dark, and one group of mice was fed the high-fat diet only during the light. Now remember, mice are nocturnal animals. It's natural for them to eat in the dark. And what they found in this 6-week experiment was that those who were fed during the light at the wrong time were gaining significantly more weight than the mice that were fed at the right time, so during the dark. There was a 5-gram difference between the weights of these two groups of mice, and this was independent of how much they were eating, and of course, what they were eating. They were all eating the same diet. So then people were starting to try to translate this into humans. And again, a very popular study in the field led by Dr. Marta Garaulet in 2013 here in Spain was this classical epidemiological study. It was a secondary analysis of a weight loss trial. What Dr. Garaulet did with her team was look at the response of people enrolled in this behavioral weight loss program based off of when they were eating their foods. Now, this was not an intervention. People were not told when they should be eating in order to lose weight. However, what the investigators did was divide the group into early eaters, those who ate lunch before 3 p.m., and late eaters, those who ate lunch after 3 p.m. And as you can see very clearly, those who were eating lunch late were losing less weight, less rapidly, whereas those who were eating early were losing more weight very quickly. And actually, you can see the separation very early on during the intervention. And again, this was independent of the calories and independent of the sources of the calories. So for the first time now, we're seeing this association between food timing as well as anthropometrics. A question at that point was, okay, should we be eating relative to our biological clock, or should we be telling people to eat based off of an arbitrary clock time, just the society clock time? To answer that question was this small study done on students at Harvard. And what they did was enroll lean and non-lean students and try to see how do they eat differently based off of circadian time and based off of societal clock time. And what they found was that for circadian time, this was based off of, they measured their melatonin to see if they were eating during the morning or the biological morning or the biological evening. And what they found was that you can see a separation between the lean and the non-lean based entirely off of circadian time. But when you looked at the societal clock, they were eating at the same societal time clock, which tells us we should be recommending people to eat according to their biological clock, not necessarily based off of our watch time, because we're all different in terms of our circadian rhythms. Now, in the start of the 2020s, we start seeing more elegant experimental studies. Now, there's more money in the field. We can do these large experiments. This was another study that I worked on with Dr. Garaulet, where we did a randomized crossover study to look at the effects of glucose on metabolism. In this study, in each participant, did 2 oral glucose tolerance tests. An early test, which was scheduled 4 hours before bedtime, and a late test, which was scheduled 1 hour before bedtime. These were supposed to replicate early dinner and late dinner. And what we found was that, these are data for glucose, that the test done during the late condition was associated with huge glucose intolerance. And this was in response to a 75-gram sugar bolus. There was roughly a 10% difference between the two groups. And then in terms of insulin, we see at night there's an impairment in insulin secretion. Insulin, or the pancreas, takes longer for it to respond to the sugars at night compared to the early night conditions. Another nice crossover study was this one done in Boston. And what I just wanted to highlight is that now you're seeing a layering of omics. Now, people wanted to understand what are the mechanisms that are involved to explain why we're seeing these types of differences. What they were able to find is that shifting our meals from early to late lead to changes in a lot of biological processes, including autophagy, lipid oxidation, as well as various amino acid metabolism. Okay, so there you go. A lot of studies done, different study designs. And this triggered the interest of the NIH, which is the main government agency in the US that funds biomedical research. In 2023, the NIH, or specifically the National Heart, Lung, Blood Institute, organized a workshop so that we can all discuss what is the current state of chrononutrition and what are also the gaps in the field of chrononutrition. Our paper was coincidentally published yesterday, so you can read it online now. So it's very perfect timing for this presentation. There are two things that I wanted to share about from that workshop. First, we agreed that chrononutrition is a new field, but it's also a modifiable behavior that if we know exactly what it does, it could really reduce cardiometabolic or improve cardiometabolic health, as well as other aspects of health as well. But we also recognize that there's so many limitations in the field because it is a new science. And I list here just 4 of those limitations. One, we don't really have very good assessment tools for chrononutrition. So if you think of traditional dietary assessment tools like 24-hour recalls, food frequency questionnaires, these are all designed to capture quantity and quality, not timing. So we really need to think of or start designing new tools for chrononutrition. And we could potentially use technology like continuous glucose monitors in order to help us do that. There are also different aspects of chrononutrition that we can think of. For example, time-restricted eating. How does that play into the field of chrononutrition? And also, is chrononutrition important for everyone, or are there specific populations that could benefit more from chrononutrition? So we often think of night shift workers because they're doing night shift. Are they a population that we need to focus on for chrononutrition studies? And of course, for me, nutrition support, for obvious reasons, are people on nutrition support worthy of chrononutrition research or should be prioritized for chrononutrition research? And lastly, we also recognize that there are a lot of social and behavioral factors that we need to understand that might influence when people choose to eat. Of course, culture plays a big role in deciding when people eat, especially here in Spain. And understanding those very clearly could help us advance this field forward. Okay. And then just a few months ago, there was this article published in the New York Times with the title, "Should Dinner Be the Smallest Meal of the Day?" It has a picture of 3 plates, a large breakfast plate, medium-sized lunch plate, small-sized dinner plate. And I show you this study to showcase that not only is this an exciting topic for researchers and clinicians, but it's also an exciting topic for the public. Otherwise, this would not have made it on the New York Times. So a lot of people, not only scientists, are very excited and interested in this field of chrononutrition. Okay, so there you go, 75 years of chrononutrition research, but I think the most excited studies are the ones that have yet to be published. With that introduction, I will now switch gears and start talking about chronobiology in the hospital setting. Okay. Many studies have shown that during critical illness, our circadian rhythms are completely disrupted, and in fact, they might even be abolished. And one of the studies that investigated this was this one published in 2020. What they did is they recruited healthy adults as well as critically ill adults. And they looked at the expression of these clock genes across 24 hours, and they compared them between the 2 groups. What I'm showing you here are the rhythmicity of clock genes in healthy individuals. And you can see for many of these core clock genes, like BMAL1 or CRY1, they show rhythmicity. During critical illness, it's all flat. These rhythmicities are completely abolished. There's no rhythmicity during critical illness. The circadian rhythms and our clock is disrupted. So what the study, as well as many others, suggested is that compared to healthy adults, during critical illness, our circadian clock is disrupted. So that gave to the emergence of this new field of circadian biology called circadian medicine. And what this field is interested in is understanding what are the time of day considerations or no considerations in the way that we provide medicine and care to patients. So not only does it look at the timing of medications, which is the predominant aspect of circadian medicine, it also looks at the timing of diagnoses made at hospitals, the timing that different operations happen in a hospital, including testing or blood draws, as well as the timing of light and nutrition and exercise, which we all know are related to the circadian clock. The first study to look at this in a large hospital system was this one published in PNAS. What they did is they just pulled all the medications and looked at when the medications in this hospital are being given, and they also looked at how it relates to the timing of rounding, when the doctors are going around to see the patients. And of course, not surprisingly, they found that those two things were were closely tied. Medications are being given because the doctor was in that room. And then they looked at particular medications to see if those timings made sense biologically. The example that they give is hydralazine, which is an antidiuretic. This antidiuretic works best at night, and it does not work great in the morning. However, they found was that it was given in the morning because that's when the doctor ordered the medication. So what they suggested in this study is that we should rethink of when we're giving our patients the medications, not based off convenience and the 24-hour system of our hospital, but based off of when these medications work best. Because if we give the medications at the right time, the patients will benefit most from these medications, and perhaps we'll give less of the medications to our patients. It'll also cost less to give less medications as well. Okay. The hospital environment, as you all know, is very artificial. It does not reflect the way that we live at home. This is a picture of an ICU. You can see there's constant light, 24 hours. It's very noisy. It's not a peaceful, restful environment. And one of the unusual things that we do at the hospital is 24-hour nutrition support, continuous nutrition support. And I'm referring to both enteral, so tube feeds, and parenteral nutrition. And actually, in our hospital system, if I go in to order nutrition, tube feeds for my patient, the default, the main order is always 24 hours. I have to manually change it to daytime if I want to give them nutrition during the daytime. So let's briefly review what are the different modalities of nutrition support. So nutrition support, both enteral and parenteral, could be administered continuously, so 24 hours, typically, of course, using an infusion pump, and this is done at a very low goal rate. Nutrition support could be administered cyclically, typically overnight, and it also uses an infusion pump, and nutrition is given typically around 12 hours, maybe a bit less, maybe a bit more than 12 hours. Nutrition support, tube feeds only, could be also administered in boluses, so intermittent or bolus. Intermittent, you're using an infusion pump, you're giving nutrition 4 to 6 times a day, large volumes per bolus. The difference between the two is that with bolus, you're pushing the nutrition through, so you're using a syringe or gravity. These two better mimic or reflect the way that we eat discrete meals throughout the day, rather than this artificial way of eating, especially at night. We know very well that nutrition support in a hospital, especially for critically ill patients, is given continuously. Why is that? I try to ask a lot of different clinicians what are the main reasons that we feed continuously, because it's not part of consensus statements or part of clinical guidelines. And these are the main reasons that actually the ones that I have found, and there might be others as well. It's presumed to be safer. It's presumed that during continuous, you're giving nutrition at a slow rate. It limits the risk of aspiration. Patients are better able to tolerate it. It has less risk for gastrointestinal problems. It also it's presumed to limit the risk of dysglycemia. You get tighter glucose control and also less metabolic burden on the liver. It's presumed that it also compensates for missed calories. In the ICU, a lot of times patients leave the ICU and then they come back. So if you give them nutrition 24 hours, you're able to give them calories whenever they are there. Some patients receive nighttime cycles, and again, I ask the question, why? A couple of reasons. Many physicians do this in order to promote hunger during the daytime so that the patients could advance to an oral diet. It's presumed that if you don't feed during the daytime, you can then, again, promote hunger. The patients will then decide to eat by mouth. And also, it is also presumed that with overnight cycles, it may promote ambulation. Patients are able to move around the ICU during the daytime more easily if they're not hooked to an infusion pump. Based off of the science in chronobiology, what we are proposing is a different feeding schedule. The different schedule that we are proposing is a daytime nutrition support in a time-restricted manner. So what does this proposal look like? For tube feeds, we are proposing to provide intermittent tube feeds. So tube feeds at 3 or 4 discrete times during the day that reflect or mimic a normal diet. We recommend the use of a feeding pump and not a syringe because it's presumed to be safer for GI tolerance. Patients who cannot tolerate intermittent, perhaps you could do daytime cycles instead. And this is also the case for parenteral nutrition, where you cannot do boluses, of course. We recommend daytime cycles that start and end during the daytime, not daytime cycles that start and end during the nighttime. You might ask, okay, what is the literature to support these feeding schedules? And actually, there isn't much out there. I'm going to share with you just a couple of studies that have been published. This is the first one published in 2022 in the Journal of Clinical Investigation. It's a pilot study done in pediatric stem cell transplant patients. What they did is that they randomized children who were starting parenteral nutrition either to continuous, which is the control, 24/7 parenteral nutrition, or daytime, 12-hour daytime parenteral nutrition. They were able to show 3 things. First, that it was feasible and safe for their patients to receive daytime restricted parenteral nutrition. They showed that with daytime nutrition, parenteral nutrition, glucose control was tighter. There were tighter glucose values compared to continuous, which you can see with the wider error bars in blue. And then the most exciting finding is that those who were on daytime restricted, those children were able to advance to an oral diet much quicker than those on continuous. So they can start eating by mouth quicker than those who stayed on a continuous infusion schedule. So this is one exciting study. It is a very small study. Another study is this one that we had published in 2022-2023, looking at home parenteral nutrition. And what we did is enroll patients who run parenteral nutrition at night, and we asked them to run the parenteral nutrition during the daytime for 1 week. And what we're able to demonstrate is that with daytime parenteral nutrition, you're starting to see more physiological glucose values across the 24 hours, which better reflect healthy adults, whereas the nighttime glucose patterns are not physiological in our opinion. And I'll talk more about this study later on. But those are really the 2 studies that have been published in the field so far. The exciting news is that there are a lot of ongoing trials in the field. I've listed here 8 ongoing clinical trials. They're still ongoing. Some of them are happening in the US, and there are a couple that are happening here in Europe. There are a couple in the Netherlands and in France as well. They all have different approaches and different hypotheses. Some of the hypotheses is that daytime restricted or intermittent compared to continuous will lead to, again, tighter glucose control, limited infection risk, more robust circadian rhythms, better muscle mass, and better sleep. And with time, we will find out whether this is the case or not as these studies get published. A question I always get is will the intermittent feeding lead to aspiration? Will it lead to increased GI intolerance in our patients compared to continuous? And actually, if you look at the SBIN guidelines, the critical ill guidelines with regards to recommending continuous over intermittent, it's given a grade of B. And if you read the paragraph here, there is really no strong evidence to suggest or support the superiority of continuous over intermittent. And there's recognition that with bolus, you might actually better promote muscle synthesis in our patients, which is something that we all want for our patients. Year after year, there's a new systematic review and meta-analysis that compares continuous to intermittent. And every year, each of these studies come up with a slightly different conclusion. Overall, what I found was that some studies indicate higher incidence of constipation and vomiting with continuous, so some risks with continuous, whereas other studies indicate higher aspiration and diarrhea with intermittent. So it's really both modalities are associated with some risk. But overall, it seems that the safety and tolerance are largely comparable between the two types of feeding schedules. Okay. We also recognize that there might be a subset of patients who might not tolerate the intermittent daytime infusion schedules. Indeed, we think that patients who are at elevated risk for aspiration should not receive intermittent, but rather might benefit from a more continuous feeding schedule, which is consistent with the Aspen consensus statement. Patients with a post-pyloric feeding tube will not tolerate intermittent, so therefore continuous might be more beneficial for them. And lastly, patients with uncontrolled glycemia might not tolerate the intermittent schedules. Okay. There are a lot of considerations that you need to take into account before implementing changes at your hospital. And some of these are listed on here. You need to reevaluate various protocols, timing-related aspects to various protocols, such as the timing of feeding tube placements, because that could influence how you feed or when you feed your patients. An important thing is reevaluating the way that you administer or you control glycemia in your patients. For example, replacing long-acting with short-acting insulin for patients switching from continuous to intermittent. And then lastly, there really needs to be this large coordinated effort across the entire clinical care team in order to establish this new infusion schedule. What we find a lot of time is that we would order the nutrition for nighttime, for daytime, but because the nurses are so used to feeding at night, they won't follow that order. So there needs to be this ongoing discussion with your entire clinical care team in order to make this a reality. I've published 2 commentaries and reviews on this topic, so if you're interested in learning more about our recommendation as well as limitations that exist in the field, these are 2 publications on that topic. Okay. And now I'll switch to the final topic, which is actually the one that I find most exciting, is the role of chronobiology in home nutrition support. And I'll talk a lot about sleep, which is an area that is of particular concern for patients on home nutrition support. So obviously, nutrition support at night in a hospital is possibly detrimental. However, it's only detrimental for a short period of time, for the number of days that a patient is admitted in an ICU or admitted in the hospital. If you think of it, patients on home nutrition support would be considered a larger or more vulnerable patient population because they are on these feeds for a much longer period of time. We think that their circadian rhythms are disrupted more chronically compared to the hospitalized patients. And not only are their circadian rhythms disrupted, their sleep is also severely disrupted. And I'll talk about some of the reasons for that. Okay. We initially did a very basic survey study. We asked patients on home enteral and home parenteral nutrition to tell us when do they run their infusions. And these are results from that survey. The majority of patients on home parenteral nutrition, over 85%, run their infusions overnight. For enteral nutrition, it's less prevalent. However, it still constitutes the largest group. 44% of patients told us that they run their tube feeds at night. And there's another study in Europe that shows very similar findings. For a subset of these patients, I then asked them, okay, tell me, when do you go to bed exactly, and when do you start and when do you stop your infusions? And these are data from one patient on home parenteral nutrition. And we asked them to do this for 7 days. And what we found was that their infusions, which are these gray bars, completely overlap with the timing of their sleep intervals. You can see that they all happen at the same time. The patients are actively receiving nutrition the entire time that they are in bed. We know through self-report that these patients tell us that their sleep is impaired. Their sleep is really disrupted by these nutrition infusions at night. But we wanted to really quantify the extent of this disruption. So what we did in this study is send patients with actigraphy devices like a Fitbit. We sent these watches to our patients' homes, and we told them to wear the watches for 7 consecutive days. And these are data from actually our first patient who did this study. This is an actogram. It shows activity and light over 24 hours. And what you can see very clearly is during the sleep intervals, these blue bands, you see a lot of black and a lot of yellow lines. There's a lot of sleep disruption and a lot of light exposure happening at night. This particular patient wakes up every 2 hours in order to urinate, in order to deal with their infusion pumps the entire time that they're trying to fall asleep. And this is not unique to this patient. Most of our patients show a very similar pattern. We see that across our patients, there's very frequent nighttime awakening. There's a lot of light at night exposure, which affects their sleep and affects their metabolism. And they also tell us that they feel very sleepy during the daytime and fatigued. They also take a lot of naps as well. And we think that's because they're not sleeping well at night. Those were data from one patient, and I'm showing here all 20 patients. Looking at different aspects of sleep. For sleep duration, 60% of our patients sleep less than 7 hours, so short sleepers. Most of our sleepers have low quality sleep, so they all fall below 85%, which is what is recommended for sleep quality. Sleep onset latency, which is how quickly patients fall asleep at night. It wasn't a problem for our patients. They were all able to fall asleep. What was a problem was staying asleep. The recommendation is only staying 20 minutes awake after falling asleep. But what we found was that these patients were spending 1 hour or sometimes 2 hours awake after falling asleep. So there's an issue, a problem with sleep maintenance. So what is affecting their sleep? Obviously, there's the nutrition support, but we think that it's more complex. There are a lot of factors that we try to describe in this review that we published just last year. It's not just the nutrition support. It's potentially also other comorbidities, medications, potential malnutrition. Oral diet could potentially also influence the way that they sleep, smoking and alcohol, the napping, and then lastly, stress and anxiety, which is highly prevalent in this population. So I'm just going to talk a bit more about about some of those. Having comorbidities, especially psychiatric disorders like depression, could affect the way that these patients sleep. Being on various medications, for example, antidiuretics, could also exacerbate wakefulness at night. Having various deficiencies like iron deficiency, essential lipids deficiencies, could also disrupt sleep. And of course, the nutrition support, having to pee at night, the infusion pump alarms, restricted sleep position, not being able to move around, and then the hyperglycemia, which I'll show you more evidence of. We know that in general, healthy adults, having more depression or having more depressive symptoms reduces the quality of your sleep. And we were able to show this relationship in home PN patients, in patients on home parenteral nutrition. The more anxious they are, the more depressive symptoms that they have, the lower the quality of their sleep. But also, this is a correlation, very strong correlation. It could also be that patients who have lower quality sleep also have more depressive symptoms. So addressing some of that anxiety and depression could potentially lead to improvements in sleep. We also looked at different ways of administering home parenteral nutrition and how it also relates to various aspects of sleep. And not surprisingly, we found that the rate of the nutrition was very closely related to sleep. So having higher rates of nutrition, was associated or correlated with lower sleep duration and lower time in bed. And this was approximately 100 mils per hour higher rate associated with 24 minutes lower sleep duration. Not only that, the volume and calories in your nutrition support is related to worsening sleep. And then we also found that the cycle duration, so having a longer cycle duration, so maybe 16 or 17 hours cycles, was also related to the time that the patients were staying in bed and also the number of times that they were awakening at night. Okay. I mentioned very briefly the hyperglycemia. And so we, again, sent our patients continuous glucose monitors to look at their 24-hour glycemia. If you look at their daily 24-hour sugars, it's actually not a bad profile. They spend 90% within the normal range and less than 10% in the low range. However, if you look at the hour-by-hour glucose readings, it's not normal. You see that at night, this is 8 p.m. Typically, our patients try to fall asleep at 9 or 10 p.m. You see that there's a lot of changes and fluctuations happening in sugars. And this is at the same time that the patients are trying to relax and rest. So imagine having a large bolus of sugar or a lot of candy at night. And this is essentially what is happening to our patients. Patients report a lot of night sweats, a lot of shakiness at night, and that, I think, is predominantly attributed to all these changes in sugars that is happening during the nighttime because their infusions are running overnight. So, can we ask patients to run their nutrition support during the daytime? Is this feasible and safe for our patients? The first patient in the world to go on home parenteral nutrition was in 1975, and this is what it looked like. It was a very bulky bag, and there were a lot of pipes and tubes. So if you ask somebody in 1975 to run their infusions during the daytime and to go out and walk around with this, it would probably be not possible. But a lot has changed over time. Infusion pumps have become more discreet, more compact. There are now nice backpacks that are more discreet, that are not obvious, that patients can carry comfortably during the daytime and walk around with. So we did a pilot study, where we enrolled 20 patients with short bowel syndrome, adult patients, and we asked them to do overnight infusions for 1 week and then daytime infusions for a second week. And what we wanted to do is assess the safety and feasibility of 1 week of daytime nutrition support, and also look at potential improvements in glycemia and potential improvements in their sleep quality. I already shared with you this figure. What we found was that we saw an inversion in their glucose profiles. Now their glucose excursions are happening during the daytime, so at the right time, compared to the nighttime, which we're showing here in blue. There was actually no difference in 24-hour glucose averages between the two groups. So we didn't necessarily see changes in glucose across 24 hours. We saw differences during the daytime between the two groups and differences at nighttime during the two groups, as we would expect. So what about sleep? Did the patients sleep better when their TPN was running during the daytime? So we assessed sleep using the watch as well as self-report. Unfortunately, with the watch, we did not see improvements in objective measures of sleep. We saw some hint of it, but it wasn't significant. What we saw with the watch was that patients were going to sleep at a different time. Now with daytime infusions, they were sleeping later in the day rather than earlier on in the day. And I think what is happening here is that when patients run infusions overnight, their life is very much influenced or dictated by their nutrition. They go to bed early because they need to start running their nutrition. Whereas if they do it during the daytime, there's now a separation between the two things. They can go to bed whenever they want to rather than when their nutrition tells them to. While we did not see improvements in sleep quality using the watches, we do see improvements in self-report. Patients did tell us that they slept better, that they were waking up less frequently. However, this wasn't necessarily shown with the watch data. During exit interviews, as the patients finished the study, I asked them, okay, so did you like the study? Would you do this long term after completing the study? So a lot of them told us that yes, they benefited from the study. During that 1 week, they felt more energetic during the daytime, they were sleeping better. One patient told us that now they're starting to dream, which is something that they weren't doing in the past. However, a lot of them also told us that there were a lot of disruptions to their lives because of the infusions during the daytime. Some patients told us that it caused back problems, especially our weaker patients. They had a hard time carrying the backpack. They told us that some napping as well, and that they also needed to find bathrooms all day during the daytime because now they needed to void during the daytime. So it wasn't perfect. So now what we recommend for patients, or at least what our study was able to conclude, was that daytime infusions of home PN is feasible, safe, and may lead to improvements in glycemia and sleep. However, daytime infusions are also cumbersome. It's a lot to deal with, might result in fatigue and limiting social interaction. Ultimately, what I do with my patients is recommending giving the patients the choice to choose between the infusion schedules and telling them that the best infusion schedule is the one that fits with their quality of life, the goals that they have for their life. And they could also consider a hybrid schedule, doing daytime for maybe the weekdays and doing nighttime on the weekends so that they can go out on the weekends. So having some hybrid schedule. Okay. The last thing that I wanted to share with you is that in realizing that many patients are still going to experience sleep disruption because it's easier for them to run their infusions overnight, we wanted to come up with sleep recommendations for our patients, knowing that a lot of the existing sleep guidelines do not apply to these patients because they do not necessarily consider nutrition support. So what we did in this study, which was funded by the Sleep Medicine Foundation, was we created a research team of patients, clinicians, as well as sleep physicians, and we collaborated with other patients as well as clinicians in order to put together sleep recommendations for patients on home parenteral nutrition. It was a long, lengthy process. It started off with an extensive literature search of existing sleep recommendations. We then met with patients, over 20 patients, in focus groups. We discussed what do they do to improve their sleep. And we also asked clinicians, how do they recommend improving patients' sleep? Because there are very few studies published on this. We then created the first set of recommendations. We sent them to a subset of patients and we asked them for their opinions to further refine them. And now these recommendations are ready and we're now widely distributing them. I'm happy to share that the recommendations are not only available in English, but they're also fully translated into Spanish. They list 36 strategies that patients have told us have widely improved the way that they sleep. So if you're interested in getting these handouts, you can take a picture of the QR code, or you can go to the Ollie Foundation website to get access to these recommendations. These recommendations also include at the end a sleep diary where patients can write down their bedtime and wake time so that they can work with their clinicians towards improving their sleep. So as a clinician, how can you support the patients of your patient? And this is relevant for both enteral and parenteral nutrition. What I typically tell other clinicians to do is to always ask about sleep. Sleep might not come up in conversations because typically these patients are dealing with so much. So always make sure that you ask about your sleep, not your sleep, but their sleep, because it's really important for not only health, but also quality of life. Keep in mind that not all patients suffer from disrupted sleep. Actually, some patients tell us that they sleep better with nutrition support. So it's not really a systematic problem. When you ask about sleep, don't only ask about quantity, but also ask about the quality of their sleep. So how many hours of sleep are you getting? What was the quality of your sleep? Did you feel relaxed in the morning? Ask about their sleep schedules on days that they receive nutrition support, as well as days that they do not receive nutrition support. And you want improved sleep on both sets of days. You can use technology like Fitbit in order to understand the quality of their sleep. As a clinician, you can also make changes to their nutrition in order to improve their sleep, specifically lowering the rate of their nutrition support, or if possible, lowering the volume and the calories in their nutrition support. And of course, if you realize that the patient still experiences sleep problems, refer them to a sleep specialist because they could potentially have a sleep disorder, whether it's insomnia or potentially sleep apnea. Okay, so with that, I would like to acknowledge members of my lab who have helped me in this research, a lot of mentors and collaborators over the years, especially Dr. Marta Graulett, who introduced me to this field, all my funders over the past several years. And this is my email address. I'm happy to take any questions now in person or over email as well. And thank you all for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dashti, for your fantastic talk, from which we have learned a lot. Normalmente en estas conferencias plenarias no suele haber preguntas, pero amablemente el doctor Dashti aceptó, si hay alguna pregunta del público, responderla. ¿Alguien quiere hacer alguna pregunta? Sí, adelante.
Hello. Do you hear me? Yeah. Thank you for your presentation and for your perfect English, very easy to understand. Do you think nowadays there is enough evidence for any recommendations to the general population about chrononutrition? And what recommendations would you give in that case?
Yep. So the question is, what about the general public? When should they be eating? So typically when we want people to stop eating is when their body is functioning during the night mode. And typically that is 2 to 3 hours before going to bed. I know in Spain things are very different, so it's hard to do here. But typically if you feel sleepy at 10 p.m., you would want to stop eating at 8 p.m. typically, because that's when your body starts switching from daytime to nighttime mode.
Thank you. And it's necessary to have breakfast early, or the hour of the breakfast doesn't matter?
So that's an excellent question too, because early breakfast could also be detrimental because your melatonin fluctuates. So if you have a very early breakfast, that could also be detrimental, just like a very late dinner. Typically, you don't want to eat within the first hour of awakening. Again, 2 to 3 hours after waking up. That is typically theoretically what is recommended. Yeah. But it hasn't made its way into guidelines yet.
Thank you very much.
Sí, tenemos allí una pregunta más, por favor.
Francisca Jolie from France. Thank you for your great talk. I have a question about parenteral nutrition because we are always thinking about these sleeping issues. On your specific trial, did you consider the oral intake, maybe some changes between daily infusion and night infusion? And did you consider some quality of life scale to see if there is some changes? Thank you.
Yep, so that's a great question. So the question was, in our pilot trial, when we asked patients to run PN during 1 week for daytime, did that lead to a decrease in oral intake, which you don't want it to happen? And in our case, we did not see a change, but also it's a small trial, so it could potentially be an issue. So you do want to track oral intake if you're recommending daytime infusions, because it could potentially suppress appetite. The other question, did it lead to improvements in quality of life? We did assess quality of life using surveys, and we do see improvements in quality of life, most of it driven by the sleep component, but it could also potentially decrease quality of life if it leads to decrease in social engagement. So again, asking your patients what aspect of quality of life is most important to them would be the best way to go.
We are on time. Thank you very much for accept our invitation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.